For years, the dominant story has been that women were moving forward, that doors were opening, that independence and empowerment would create a better future. Yet, when we step back and look at the broader picture, something does not add up. Around the world, women are reporting higher levels of financial stress, lower life satisfaction, declining health, and growing uncertainty about their futures. This is not limited to one country or one culture. It is global. Poverty among women is increasing, especially among those without family support structures, stable partnerships, or intergenerational safety nets. And the most troubling part is that many of the systems that promised protection and opportunity are now the very systems trapping them. For decades, women were told that reliance on men was weakness and that self sufficiency through institutions would guarantee security. Marriage was reframed as optional, family as negotiable, and long term partnership as something that could always be postponed. Men were increasingly portrayed as unnecessary or even obstructive. Over time, this messaging reshaped behavior on both sides. Men adapted by withdrawing, they stopped approaching, stopped offering informal support, stopped assuming responsibility for outcomes they were told they had no right to influence. What we are now seeing is the downstream effect of that cultural shift. When men step back, the systems women were encouraged to trust do not step forward in the same way. Historically, men served as buffers between women and external pressures. That buffer took many forms. It included physical protection, economic provision, emotional stability, and advocacy against institutions that overreached. When families were intact, risks were distributed. When communities were tight, individuals were not isolated. As those bonds weakened, the responsibility did not disappear. It was transferred. Increasingly, it was transferred to centralized systems that operate on rules, not relationships. Rules do not bend for individual hardship. Rules do not provide grace. Rules do not negotiate. One of the most overlooked consequences of this transition is the loss of choice. Modern rhetoric celebrates choice endlessly, yet in practice, options have narrowed. Many women today must work regardless of circumstance. They must carry debt regardless of outcome. They must remain economically productive well into older age despite declining health. The option to step back, to prioritize family, to rely on a partner, or to restructure life around children has become financially impossible for many. This is not freedom, it is obligation framed as liberation. Another uncomfortable truth is that when accountability is removed from a system, consequences do not vanish, they accumulate. For years, difficult questions were dismissed as outdated or hostile. Any attempt to discuss long term trade offs was labeled negative or regressive. But time does not respond to slogans. Biology does not negotiate with ideology. Economic pressure does not care about intentions. The result is a generation of women who followed the prescribed path and now find themselves overworked, undersupported, and deeply uncertain about what comes next. At the same time, men have been quietly recalibrating. When repeatedly told they are the problem, many eventually accept the message and disengage. They limit interaction to what is necessary. They minimize risk. They comply strictly with rules rather than spirit. In some countries, we are seeing the effects of this dynamic play out in extreme ways. Birth rates collapse not because people dislike children, but because cooperation between men and women has broken down. Relationships become transactional or adversarial. Initiative disappears, avoidance becomes rational. In workplaces, the shift is equally visible. Mentorship becomes selective. Informal support networks shrink. People focus inward. When competition replaces cooperation, those without strong alliances lose ground quickly. This is especially damaging for individuals who rely on relational leverage rather than structural authority. Over time, isolation compounds, Advancement slows, frustration grows, blame is redirected rather than resolved. Consumer culture offers another window into this transformation. Entire industries once relied on male participation. Social venues, dating oriented businesses, nightlife, and even certain retail sectors depended on men spending discretionary income in shared spaces. As men withdrew, those spaces emptied, businesses struggled. What replaced them was not a balanced alternative, but fragmentation. People stayed home, interactions moved online, real world social cohesion weakened further. Parallel to this is the normalization of monetized self exposure as a financial strategy. Young women are increasingly encouraged to view personal visibility as income. While marketed as empowerment, the reality is far less glamorous. The vast majority earn very little, digital footprints persist indefinitely, professional opportunities shrink, social stigma quietly follows. When the temporary income fades, the long term costs remain. Again, short term relief traded for long term limitation. Meanwhile, centralized authority expands under the banner of safety and regulation. Digital identification systems, online verification requirements, financial tracking, and behavior monitoring are introduced gradually, always justified as protection. But protection comes with control. Access becomes conditional. Participation requires compliance. Those without independent support structures feel this pressure most acutely. When personal networks dissolve, individuals become dependent on systems that cannot prioritize them as individuals. The irony is that many of the freedoms women fought for now exist only on paper. Legal rights mean little without social trust. Speech means little without an audience willing to listen. Choice means little when every option carries significant risk. As men disengage, the informal safeguards that once softened hardship disappear. What remains is bureaucracy. The long term demographic outlook makes this even more concerning. Large percentages of women will reach middle age without partners or children. Some will be single by choice, but many will not. Economic instability will be more severe for those aging alone. At the same time, automation and artificial intelligence disproportionately affect sectors where women are concentrated. Care, administration, service, and communication roles are especially vulnerable. As jobs vanish, competition intensifies. Men, facing similar pressures, respond differently. They form closed networks. They build parallel systems. They exchange skills and resources outside centralized oversight. These systems are difficult to access without trust. Trust is increasingly rare. Without inclusion, women find themselves excluded not by law, but by structure. Entry barriers rise, costs increase, dependence deepens. None of this requires malicious intent to function. Systems do not need to hate anyone to produce unequal outcomes. They simply follow incentives. When incentives reward withdrawal, withdrawal increases. When incentives punish risk, risk disappears. When incentives discourage cooperation, separation becomes logical. The most tragic aspect of the shift is that it was avoidable. Balance was possible, partnership was possible, mutual responsibility was possible. Instead, society chose narratives that simplified complex realities. It chose slogans over strategy. It chose immediate validation over sustainable design. What we are seeing now is not a punishment, it is a bill coming due. The consequences were delayed, not erased, and the longer they were ignored, the heavier they became. As we move deeper into this decade, the question is not whether hardship will increase. It already is. The question is who will be equipped to navigate it? Those with strong alliances, adaptable skills, and realistic expectations will fare better. Those who were taught that systems would always catch them may find themselves unprepared. This conversation is uncomfortable precisely because it challenges narratives many people built their lives around. But discomfort is not harm, avoidance is. The sooner we are willing to speak honestly about outcomes, the sooner adjustments can be made. As we move further into this discussion, it becomes necessary to step away from emotional reactions and look at patterns over time. History shows that societies do not collapse all at once. They fracture slowly, beginning with trust, then cooperation, and finally shared responsibility. What makes the current moment unique is how openly these fractures are being encouraged while being labeled as progress. When cooperation between men and women erodes, the entire social structure weakens because families are the foundation that everything else rests upon. Without families, communities hollow out. Without communities, individuals become isolated and it's managed by systems rather than supported by people. One of the most significant shifts has been the reframing of dependence. In previous generations, dependence within a family was seen as mutual obligation. Men depended on women for family continuity, emotional grounding, and social cohesion. Women depended on men for stability, provision, and protection from external pressures. This was not one sided dominance, it was interdependence. Modern ideology replaced this with institutional dependence, encouraging individuals to outsource security to governments, employers, platforms, and financial systems. The problem is that these entities are not designed to care about individual outcomes. They are designed to scale, regulate, and extract value. As men step back from informal responsibility, women increasingly found themselves negotiating directly with impersonal systems. Loans replace provision, contracts replace trust, policies replace judgment. This might sound efficient on paper, but it removes flexibility from human life. When a family faces hardship, they adapt. When a system faces hardship, it enforces compliance. Many women today live under constant pressure to perform economically, regardless of health, family needs, or personal limits. This pressure compounds over time, leading to burnout, anxiety, and declining physical well being. Another consequence rarely discussed is how delayed family formation impacts long term stability. Biology does not pause for ideology. Fertility declines predictably with age. Energy levels change. Recovery slows. When women are encouraged to postpone family formation indefinitely in pursuit of career milestones that may never materialize, the cost is often irreversible. By the time many realize the trade off, options have narrowed dramatically. This is not about blaming individuals. It is about acknowledging that incentives were misaligned and consequences were obscured. At the same time, men observing these dynamics adjust accordingly. They see higher legal risk, lower relational stability, and diminishing returns for long term investment. Rational behavior in an uncertain environment is caution. Many men choose solitude not out of bitterness, but out of risk management. They invest in skills, personal projects, and self sufficiency. They minimize exposure to situations where intent can be misinterpreted or weaponized. This is not hostility, it is adaptation. The ripple effects of this adaptation extend far beyond dating. In professional environments, collaboration becomes guarded. In social spaces, interactions become transactional. In public discourse, conversations become polarized rather than productive. When trust declines, every interaction carries a hidden cost. Over time, people stop engaging altogether. The social fabric thins. This thinning fabric is most visible in urban environments. Cities once thrived on density, diversity, and interaction. Today, many are experiencing loneliness at scale. Individuals surrounded by millions feel more isolated than ever. Social rituals disappear. Shared norms dissolve. Without informal accountability, behavior becomes more extreme at both ends. Systems respond with more rules, which further discourage organic interaction. The cycle reinforces itself. Economic pressure amplifies these trends. Inflation, housing costs, healthcare expenses, and education debt weigh heavily on individuals without shared support. Dual income households once provided resilience. As fewer form, vulnerability increases. Single adults face higher per person costs for nearly everything. Savings become harder to build. Emergencies become more destabilizing. Retirement becomes uncertain. The promise that independence would equal security overlooked one critical reality. Independence without cooperation leads to fragility. Humans are not designed to operate as isolated units indefinitely. We evolved in groups, families, and tribes. Removing those structures without replacing them with something equally adaptive creates systemic weakness. And another area where this becomes apparent is mental health. Women report rising levels of anxiety, depression, and dissatisfaction, despite unprecedented access to education, technology, and opportunity. This contradiction confuses many observers, but when viewed through the lens of relational loss and constant pressure, it becomes clearer. Achievement without meaning does not sustain well being. Autonomy without belonging feels hollow. Men experience their own version of this strain, but respond differently. Where women often internalize stress, men externalize by withdrawing. This divergence further complicates communication. Each side feels unheard. Each interprets the other through incompatible frameworks. Without shared language, resolution becomes impossible. Media narratives exacerbate this divide by rewarding outrage and simplification. Complex social dynamics are reduced to slogans, is sacrificed for clicks. Individuals are encouraged to identify as victims or villains rather than participants in a shared system. This framing prevents accountability and reinforces division. It also distracts from the role of institutions that benefit from fragmentation. As centralized systems expand, individual agency contracts, surveillance increases, compliance requirements multiply. Participation becomes conditional. Those who cannot or will not conform face exclusion. For individuals already isolated, this exclusion is devastating. Without family or community buffers, institutional penalties hit harder and last longer. The irony is that many policies introduced in the name of safety ultimately reduce resilience. When people are discouraged from forming informal support networks, they become more dependent on formal ones. When those formal systems fail, there is nothing left to catch them. The result is widespread insecurity masked by bureaucratic language. The future trajectory of these trends points toward greater separation between those who can operate independently of centralized systems and those who cannot. Skills that enable autonomy become more valuable. Networks built on trust become more exclusive. Entry requires reputation rather than credentials. For those outside these circles, options shrink. Women disproportionately face barriers in this emerging landscape because many were encouraged to prioritize credentials over networks, institutions over relationships, and ideology over adaptability. Reversing this requires humility and recalibration, but doing so is emotionally difficult when entire identities were built around promised outcomes. The hardest truth to confront is that no system can replace mutual responsibility between men and women. Not governments, not corporations, not platforms. When that responsibility is abandoned, everyone loses, but those with fewer physical and economic buffers lose faster. The coming years will test these dynamics further. Economic shocks, technological displacement, and demographic shifts will intensify pressure. Those who adapt early will fare better. Those who cling to narratives disconnected from reality will struggle. This is not a call for panic, it is a call for awareness. Understanding the direction of these trends allows individuals to make informed choices rather than reactive ones. Awareness restores agency. As you listen, ask yourself where your dependencies lie. Ask yourself who you can rely on when systems falter. Ask yourself whether the path you were encouraged to follow actually leads where you were told it would. These are uncomfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Avoiding them does not prevent outcomes, it only delays preparation. We are not witnessing the end of society. We are witnessing a reconfiguration. Whether that reconfiguration produces stability or fragmentation depends on whether people are willing to confront reality without ideological filters. Your observations matter because lived experience often reveals truths statistics obscure. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. To understand where things are heading, we have to look at how power actually functions in modern societies rather than how it is described. Power today is less about force and more about access to money, access to systems, access to information, access to networks, and access to opportunity. When people hear about freedom, they often imagine the absence of restriction, but in reality, freedom is the ability to move through systems without friction. When that movement becomes restricted, freedom shrinks even if rights still exist on paper. This is where many women now find themselves. They technically have more rights than ever before, yet they experience more friction in daily life, more dependence on approvals, and more vulnerability to rule changes they have no control over. For generations, men acted as informal gate openers. They connected women to work, to housing, to resources, to safety, and to social legitimacy. This did not require perfection or dominance. It required responsibility. As men disengaged, those informal bridges disappeared. Women were told the system would replace those bridges, but systems do not advocate. They do not bend. They do not sacrifice for individuals. They optimize for compliance. This creates an environment where survival depends on how well someone fits predefined categories rather than how much they contribute relationally. Now, one of the most misunderstood developments of the modern era is the rise of compliance based interaction. People are taught not to engage organically, but to document, record, verify, and protect themselves. Trust is treated as naive, caution is rewarded. Over time, this reshapes behavior. Men, in particular, are highly sensitive to risk. When rules punish intent, regardless of outcome, rational actors minimize exposure. This explains why avoidance has become the dominant strategy. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. It is not apathy. It is calculation. As avoidance becomes widespread, it reshapes entire markets. Dating platforms replace social spaces. Contracts replace conversations. Policies replace discretion. The warmth of human interaction cools. People begin to experience life through interfaces rather than relationships. For individuals already prone to anxiety or insecurity, this environment is deeply destabilizing. It reinforces isolation while presenting itself as connection. Another overlooked factor is how language has been weaponized. Words that once described behavior now describe identity. Disagreement becomes hostility. Boundaries become exclusion. This creates a chilling effect on honest communication. Men who tend to communicate directly find themselves constantly translating or withholding thoughts to avoid misinterpretation. Over time, silence becomes safer than speech. Silence becomes distance. The cost of this breakdown is not evenly distributed. Women rely more heavily on relational stability for well being. When those relationships weaken, the emotional toll is significant. Loneliness is not merely a feeling, it has measurable health consequences. Stress hormones increase, immune response declines, sleep quality deteriorates. These effects compound over years, not weeks. This is why so many women report declining health despite improved access to healthcare technology. The problem is not treatment, it is environment. Economic vulnerability magnifies these issues. Without a partner to share risk, every setback hits harder. A missed paycheck, a medical expense, a housing increase. Each event carries greater weight. Over time, this leads to constant vigilance, which erodes mental clarity and long term planning. People in survival mode cannot build, they can only react. At the same time, institutions benefit from this state of dependency. Individuals under pressure are easier to manage. They comply more readily. They accept terms they would otherwise reject. This is not conspiracy, it is structural incentive. Large systems expand when individuals lack alternatives. This is why parallel networks form quietly, outside formal oversight. Men who historically built informal economies and trade networks revert to this behavior under pressure. These parallel systems are not advertised, they are built on reputation. Access is granted through trust, not credentials. Mistakes are handled demmed internally. Accountability is direct. For those inside, resilience increases. For those outside, these systems are invisible. This creates a widening gap between people who can operate independently and those who cannot. Women often struggle to access these networks because they require long term consistency, discretion, and contribution without immediate reward. These traits were discouraged for decades in favor of individual advancement and public validation. Rebuilding those habits takes time, and many do not realize the need until exclusion becomes unavoidable. Technology accelerates this divide. Digital identification, platform moderation, financial tracking, and algorithmic filtering all centralize control. Participation becomes conditional on compliance with shifting standards. Those who rely entirely on these platforms for income, communication, or validation are vulnerable to sudden exclusion. Appeals are automated, accountability is diffuse. There is no one to negotiate with. Men respond to this by diversifying multiple income streams, offline skills, redundant networks, reduced visibility. This is not about dominance, it is about redundancy. Systems fail. People who understand this prepare accordingly. Those who are taught that visibility equals value often find themselves exposed rather than protected. The cultural narrative that safety should override all other considerations has unintended consequences. Safety without autonomy becomes confinement. Protection without agency becomes control. When people trade freedom for perceived security, they often end up with neither. This trade off disproportionately affects those who prioritize emotional reassurance over structural resilience. Another critical issue is time horizon. Men tend to think in longer cycles. Women are often encouraged to focus on immediate experience. When policies reward short term comfort at the expense of long term stability, the damage is delayed but severe. Debt accumulates, skills atrophy, opportunities expire. By the time consequences surface, reversal is difficult. This is evident in education. Many women pursued degrees with the expectation of security, only to discover oversaturated job markets and stagnant wages. Credentials without leverage do not protect against economic pressure. Meanwhile, trades and technical skills quietly regain value, often dominated by men who opted out of traditional pathways. The emotional impact of these realizations is profound. People who followed the rules feel betrayed. They were promised outcomes that did not materialize. This creates anger, confusion, and resentment. Instead of questioning the system, many turn that frustration outward, deepening division rather than resolving it. Media amplifies this cycle by framing every issue as moral conflict rather than structural design. This keeps attention focused on interpersonal blame rather than institutional incentive. As long as men and women argue with each other, the systems extracting value remain unchallenged. One of the most sobering realities is that children are the ultimate collateral. Declining birth rates signal more than lifestyle preference. They reflect a loss of confidence in the future. People do not invest in long term projects when stability feels uncertain. Societies without children age rapidly. Support ratios collapse. Economic pressure intensifies. Care burdens increase. These are not abstract projections, they are already unfolding. Women who delay or forego motherhood often assume alternatives will provide fulfillment later. Many discover too late that certain doors do not reopen. This is not tragedy by design, it is tragedy by denial. Honest conversations were discouraged when they mattered most. Men, observing these patterns, increasingly choose paths that minimize obligation. This further reduces opportunities for partnership. The cycle feeds itself. Less cooperation leads to less trust, which leads to more avoidance, which leads to deeper isolation. Breaking the cycle requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. It requires recognizing that equality does not mean interchangeability. Men and women contribute differently. When those differences are denied, systems misallocate responsibility. When responsibility is misallocated, failure follows. The future will reward those who rebuild cooperation on realistic terms, not ideological terms, not nostalgic fantasies. Practical cooperation rooted in mutual benefit and accountability. This requires recalibration on both sides. Women who adapt will focus on resilience rather than validation, skills over status, relationships over platforms, long term stability over short term approval. Men who engage will do so selectively, prioritizing environments where trust is reciprocal. This transition will not be smooth. There will be resistance, there will be denial, there will be pain. But ignoring reality does not prevent its arrival, it only ensures unpreparedness. As these dynamics unfold, something else becomes increasingly clear. Most people were never given a framework to understand trade offs. They were given promises instead. Promises are comforting because they remove the need for responsibility. If the outcome is guaranteed, then choices feel safe. But life does not operate on guarantees, it operates on probabilities shaped by behavior over time. When people are shielded from understanding this, they make decisions optimized for the short term while unknowingly sacrificing the long term. That is the quiet trap many women now find themselves in. They were told to prioritize independence without being taught the cost of isolation. They were told to pursue fulfillment without being warned that fulfillment requires sacrifice, patience, and structure. One of the most damaging illusions promoted over the past several decades was the idea that social bonds are optional accessories rather than load bearing structures. Family was framed as restrictive, commitment was framed as limiting, dependence was framed as weakness. But what was never explained is that removing these bonds does not make a person lighter, it makes them exposed. When pressure increases, there is nothing to distribute the weight. Every challenge lands directly on the individual. Over time, this creates chronic stress and erodes resilience. Men recognize this exposure early because they were the first to experience the consequences of being treated as disposable. As expectations rose and appreciation declined, many quietly opted out. They did not protest. They did not demand recognition. They simply stopped volunteering effort where the cost exceeded the return. This withdrawal was not coordinated, but it was consistent. And because it was silent, it went unnoticed until its effects became impossible to ignore. What we are witnessing now is the secondary impact of that withdrawal. Without male participation, many systems struggle to function at the same level. Informal maintenance disappears. Voluntary labor vanishes. Risk taking declines. Innovation slows. These gaps are filled temporarily by policy, regulation, or automation, but those replacements lack adaptability. They enforce rules rather than solve problems. Women encountering these rigid systems for the first time often feel blindsided. They were told institutions would protect them. Instead, they encounter forms, wait times, eligibility criteria, and conditional assistance. Help is available, but only if you fit the model. Deviate, and the system simply stops responding. There is no empathy in an algorithm, no flexibility in a policy manual. This is where the myth of empowerment collapses. Empowerment without leverage is cosmetic. True leverage comes from being needed, not just included. When men were integral to family formation, community stability, and economic continuity, women benefited from that leverage indirectly. As men disengaged, that leverage disappeared. Systems do not replace leverage, they replace responsibility with compliance. Another consequence rarely discussed is how social signaling has replaced substance. Visibility is mistaken for value. Online engagement is mistaken for influence. Applause is mistaken for security. These signals provide dopamine, not durability. They fade quickly and require constant replenishment. When they stop, there is nothing underneath to fall back on. This leaves many women emotionally exhausted and financially precarious despite appearing successful on the surface. At the same time, the ability to self assess has eroded. Honest feedback is scarce. Discomfort is avoided. Any challenge to perception is framed as hostility. This makes course correction nearly impossible. When reality finally asserts itself, the shock is severe. People who were never taught to recalibrate struggle to adapt. They double down on narratives rather than changing behavior. Men, by contrast, tend to receive blunt feedback early. Failure is rarely softened. Consequences are immediate. This forces adaptation. Over time, this creates a mindset oriented toward risk management and contingency planning. While not pleasant, it produces resilience. This difference in conditioning explains much of the divergence we now see. As centralized oversight increases, personal discretion declines. Decisions once made within families or communities are now made by distant authorities using generalized data. This removes nuance. It also removes accountability. When no individual is responsible, outcomes worsen without correction. Those affected are told to trust the process. Trust erodes when results consistently disappoint. The growing emphasis on surveillance and verification further discourages organic interaction. People self censor. They avoid engagement. They retreat into controlled environments. This reduces opportunities for connection precisely when connection is most needed. Loneliness becomes normalized. Isolation becomes invisible because it is widespread. Economic realities intensify this isolation. Housing costs force people to live alone or with strangers rather than extended family. Work schedules fragment time. Remote interaction replaces shared experience. Without intentional effort, relationships wither. Rebuilding them later is difficult because the infrastructure is gone. The long term cost of this fragmentation will not be evenly shared. Those without partners or children will face aging alone. Healthcare needs will increase. Support networks will be thin. At the same time, fewer young people will be available to provide care or sustain public systems. This demographic imbalance places enormous strain on social structures already stretched thin. Women who believed they could rely on public support in later life may be disappointed. Governments are heavily indebted. Resources are finite. Promises made decades ago are increasingly difficult to honor. When budgets tighten, assistance shrinks, eligibility narrows, waiting lists grow. Those without private support feel the squeeze first. Men, anticipating this, increasingly prioritize self sufficiency. They reduce dependence on promises they do not control. They invest in tangible skills, durable assets, and trusted networks. This is not ideology, it is pattern recognition. When systems show fragility, rational actors prepare alternatives. These alternatives are not utopian, they are pragmatic, skill sharing, mutual aid, informal trade, local cooperation. They function because they are based on trust built over time. They exclude those who are unreliable, unpredictable, or entitled. This exclusion is not personal, it is structural. Women attempting to enter these spaces often encounter resistance, not because of gender, but because of mismatched expectations. These networks value contribution without recognition, effort without applause, accountability without negotiation. This can feel harsh to those what is accustomed to institutional accommodation. But these standards exist because failure within small systems has immediate consequences. The broader culture, however, continues to promote the opposite values: comfort over competence, expression over discipline, safety over resilience. These messages resonate emotionally but fail structurally. They leave people unprepared for adversity. One of the most painful realizations for many women is that the world does not adapt to feelings, it adapts to incentives. Policies shape behavior, behavior shapes outcomes. When incentives discourage cooperation, cooperation declines. When incentives reward avoidance, avoidance spreads. Reversing these trends requires recalibrating expectations. It requires acknowledging that independence has limits and that partnership is not oppression. It requires understanding that freedom without structure is chaos, and structure without trust is control. Balance matters. This does not mean returning to the past, it means learning from it. The goal is not dependency. The goal is interdependence, shared responsibility, mutual accountability. These concepts are not fashionable, but they are functional. Women who thrive in the coming years will be those who recognize this early. They will invest in real skills, not symbolic credentials. They will build relationships grounded in reciprocity, not validation. They will prioritize stability over status and long term security over short term approval. Men who engage will do so carefully. They will look for environments where cooperation is rewarded rather than punished, where boundaries are respected, where trust is built gradually. They will avoid spaces dominated by ideological hostility because those spaces are high risk and low reward. The gap between those who adapt and those who resist will widen, not because of cruelty, but because reality enforces consequences impartially. Adaptation is not optional, it is inevitable. At this stage, it becomes impossible to ignore the role that incentives play in shaping human behavior. People do not act based on ideals alone. They act based on what is rewarded, what is punished, and what is ignored. For a long time, society rewarded narratives over outcomes. It rewarded appearance over substance. It rewarded compliance over competence. These incentives reshaped priorities quietly but profoundly. Women were encouraged to pursue paths that looked impressive rather than paths that were resilient. Men were discouraged from leadership unless it aligned perfectly with approved frameworks. The result was a collective drift away from responsibility and toward performative alignment. When responsibility disappears, fragility takes its place. Responsibility forces people to think ahead, to consider second and third order effects. Fragility thrives on short term reassurance. It avoids discomfort and postpones hard decisions. Over time, fragility spreads because it feels easier in the moment. But when pressure increases, fragile systems break quickly and unpredictably. One of the clearest examples of this is how relationships are now formed and dissolved. Commitment has been reframed as negotiable at any moment. Stability is treated as optional. The language of flexibility sounds appealing, but flexibility without commitment produces instability. People hesitate to invest deeply when exits are always open. They keep emotional distance. They withhold effort. This erodes trust on both sides. Women often feel this erosion most acutely because emotional security has historically been tied to long term bonding. When bonds are unstable, anxiety increases. The constant need to assess risk, read signals, and protect oneself becomes exhausting. This state of vigilance is not sustainable over decades. It wears people down quietly, often manifesting as health issues later in life. Men experience a parallel but different exhaustion. They learn that effort does not guarantee appreciation or continuity. They learn that intentions can be reinterpreted retroactively. Over time, they reduce effort not out of bitterness but efficiency. Why invest heavily in systems that do not reward consistency? Why commit to roles that offer liability without authority? This mutual retreat creates a vacuum that institutions rush to fill. Policies expand, regulations multiply, oversight increases. Each layer is introduced as a solution to a specific problem, but collectively, they create an environment where personal judgment is replaced by procedural compliance. This removes humanity from decision making. Women navigating these systems often discover that empathy is not built into the process. There is no space for nuance, no recognition of individual context. Assistance comes with conditions. Miss one requirement and support vanishes. Appeal processes are slow and impersonal. Stress accumulates. The promise that institutional protection would replace interpersonal cooperation is exposed as incomplete at best. Institutions can provide baseline order. They cannot provide belonging. They cannot provide loyalty. They cannot provide meaning. Those things emerge from relationships, not rules. As social trust declines, people begin to cluster into smaller, more homogeneous groups. These groups prioritize shared values, predictability, and mutual benefit. Entry becomes selective, exit becomes costly. This is how parallel societies form, not through rebellion, but through self selection. Men have historically been more willing to operate within these informal structures because they are accustomed to direct accountability. Failure has immediate consequences. Success brings tangible benefit. There is little room for ambiguity. This environment rewards competence and reliability over expression. Women entering these spaces often find the lack of emotional cushioning jarring. Feedback is direct, expectations are clear. There is little tolerance for inconsistency. While challenging, this environment is also empowering for those willing to adapt. It offers clarity rather than reassurance. The problem is that many women were never encouraged to develop this mode of engagement. They were taught that inclusion was a right rather than something earned through contribution. When that expectation collides with reality, frustration follows. The instinctive response is to seek intervention rather than adaptation. This is where the cycle reinforces itself. Intervention expands, autonomy contracts, dependency deepens. Each step feels protective, but collectively it reduces agency. People become managed rather than empowered. Another layer to this dynamic is the erosion of intergenerational continuity. In the past, older women guided younger ones through realistic expectations about life, relationships, and trade offs. Today, much of that wisdom has been replaced by online narratives optimized for engagement rather than truth. Advice is detached from accountability. Outcomes are rarely revisited. As a result, many women reach midlife surprised by realities that were entirely predictable. Fertility declines, energy changes, career ceilings appear, loneliness emerges. This shock is not due to ignorance, it is due to miseducation. Hard truths were filtered out because they were inconvenient. Men observing this pattern increasingly opt out of mentorship roles. They recognize that advice is often rejected unless it aligns with pre existing beliefs. Offering guidance carries risk without reward. Silence becomes safer. The long term consequence is a society where fewer people are prepared for adulthood as it actually functions. Expectations are inflated. Resilience is underdeveloped. Systems strain under the weight of unmet promises. Economic shifts will intensify this strain. Automation continues to replace roles that rely on repetition and communication. Many positions historically filled by women are particularly vulnerable. When these roles disappear, competition increases, wages stagnate, anxiety rises. At the same time, physical and technical roles regain importance. These roles often require hands on skill, risk tolerance, and long training periods. They are less easily automated. Men disproportionately occupy these spaces because they were encouraged to pursue them when others were told they were undesirable or regressive. This creates a widening economic divide that mirrors the social divide. Those with durable skills and networks gain leverage. Those without become more dependent on centralized support. Dependency reduces bargaining power. Bargaining power determines quality of life. The emotional toll of this realization is heavy. Many women feel misled. They did everything they were told to do and still find themselves insecure. The instinctive response is anger. Anger seeks a target. Often, that target is men. This further alienates potential allies and deepens isolation. Men respond by withdrawing further. Hostility confirms their assessment that engagement carries excessive risk. The divide hardens. Breaking this pattern requires reframing the conversation entirely. The issue is not men versus women, it is incentives versus outcomes, it is narrative versus reality. It is short term validation versus long term stability. Women who recognize this pivot point have an opportunity to adapt. Adaptation does not mean surrendering dignity or ambition, it means recalibrating priorities. It means investing in skills that compound, relationships that endure, environments that reward accountability. Men who engage constructively will do so where mutual respect exists, where expectations are explicit, where responsibility is shared. These spaces will be smaller, quieter, and less visible than mainstream platforms, but they will be more stable. The broader culture may continue to resist the shift because it threatens established narratives, but reality does not negotiate, it only responds. As this transformation continues, people will be forced to choose between comfort and competence, between dependence and autonomy, between narratives that feel good and strategies that work. Those choices will determine outcomes more than any policy or platform ever could. As the landscape continues to shift, one of the most important realizations is that stability is no longer something that can be assumed. For much of modern history, people built their lives around the expectation that institutions would remain functional and predictable. Jobs would exist, pensions would pay out, public systems would scale as needed. That assumption is eroding. The systems themselves are under strain from debt, demographic imbalance, and technological disruption. When systems strain, they tighten, they narrow eligibility, they prioritize efficiency over care. Individuals who lack buffers feel this pressure first and hardest. Women are disproportionately exposed to this reality because many were encouraged to orient their lives around institutional pathways rather than relational ones. Degrees, credentials, Platforms and employers were presented as reliable anchors, but anchors only work if the ground beneath them is stable. As conditions change, these anchors loosen. The result is a growing sense of insecurity that no amount of personal branding or compliance can fully resolve. Another factor that deepens this insecurity is the erosion of informal reciprocity. In the past, people helped each other not because it was mandated, but because it was expected. Neighbors assisted neighbors, families pooled resources, communities absorbed shocks together. These informal systems operated quietly and efficiently because they were rooted in shared obligation. As these bonds weakened, responsibility shifted upward to centralized authorities. Centralized authorities cannot replicate informal reciprocity at scale. They can only approximate it through policy, which is slower, more rigid, and less humane. Men historically carried a significant portion of this informal load. They fixed things without invoices. They intervened without paperwork. They absorbed risk quietly. When men withdrew from these roles, the gap became visible only when no one else stepped in. Women encountering this absence often feel abandoned, but from the male perspective, the withdrawal is a rational response to decades of discouragement and risk amplification. This gap has cascading effects. Infrastructure decays, community standards decline, minor problems accumulate until they become major ones. Institutions respond by imposing more oversight. Oversight discourages initiative. Initiative declines further. The loop tightens. Within this environment, narratives that promise effortless empowerment become especially seductive. They offer emotional relief without demanding structural change. But relief is temporary. When reality reasserts itself, disappointment intensifies. People begin to feel deceived, not because someone lied outright, but because critical information was omitted. One of the most omitted truths is that adulthood requires trade offs that cannot be optimized away. Time spent building one area of life is time not spent building another. Energy is finite. Attention is finite. Relationships require maintenance. Skills require practice. When everything is framed as equally achievable simultaneously, people make choices that look efficient in the short term, but are unsustainable long term. This is particularly relevant when discussing delayed partnership and family formation. Many women were told that these could always be postponed without consequence. Biology was treated as flexible. Time was treated as abundant. In reality, windows narrow gradually and then suddenly. When the shift becomes noticeable, panic replaces planning. Options shrink. Pressure mounts. Men observing this pattern respond by becoming more selective. They recognize that entering partnerships later in life often comes with higher complexity and lower alignment. They prioritize simplicity and predictability. This further reduces opportunities for women who delayed decisions based on misleading assurances. Another underexamined aspect of this dynamic is how modern culture treats accountability. Accountability has been reframed as punishment rather than feedback. When mistakes are punished harshly, people hide them. When outcomes are divorced from responsibility, learning stops. Societies that function well strike a balance. They allow room for error while maintaining consequences. That balance has been lost. Women are often shielded from direct accountability early in life, which feels supportive but becomes harmful later. When feedback finally arrives, it is abrupt and overwhelming. Men who experience harsher feedback earlier develop coping mechanisms sooner. This difference in conditioning produces divergent responses to adversity. As adversity increases across the board, these differences become more pronounced. Women often seek validation and reassurance. Men often seek control and distance. Neither response is inherently wrong, but when they occur in isolation, they prevent cooperation. Each side feels misunderstood. Each retreats further. Technology compounds this problem by mediating nearly every interaction. Algorithms reward engagement, not resolution. Conflict spreads faster than cooperation. Extreme narratives outperform nuanced ones. People are incentivized to perform identity rather than solve problems. This creates a distorted sense of consensus. Loud voices appear dominant even when they represent a minority. In this environment, women who struggle are often encouraged to externalize blame rather than reassess strategy. This feels empowering initially, but prevents adaptation. Men respond by disengaging from discourse entirely. Silence becomes a form of self protection. The result is a growing communication void. Parallel economies and networks fill this void quietly. They do not announce themselves. They grow through trust, shared experience, and mutual benefit. These networks favor those who contribute reliably and do not seek constant recognition. They value discretion. They are resistant to ideological capture because ideology introduces instability. Women attempting to access these networks often face a steep learning curve. The rules are unwritten but strict. Contribution precedes inclusion. Trust is earned slowly. Emotional volatility is costly. While this environment can feel unwelcoming, it is also resilient. It survives precisely because it does not compromise standards for comfort. Those who adapt find that these networks provide something institutions cannot: real support, practical help, accountability that is personal rather than procedural. But adaptation requires shedding expectations formed in very different environments. It requires humility, it requires patience, it requires consistency. Many will resist this adaptation because it challenges deeply held beliefs about entitlement and fairness, but fairness in abstract does not guarantee survival in practice. Systems reward those who align with their logic. Ignoring that logic does not change outcomes. The coming years will force a reckoning with these realities. Economic volatility will expose fragility. Technological change will accelerate displacement. Demographic shifts will strain support systems. Those with strong personal networks will weather these storms better than those relying solely on formal structures. Women who recognize this early can reposition themselves. This does not require abandoning ambition, it requires redefining it. Ambition rooted in stability rather than visibility. Achievement measured by resilience rather than applause. Success defined by sustainability rather than status. Men who choose to engage will do so where effort is respected and risk is shared. They will avoid environments where liability outweighs authority. They will invest in relationships that demonstrate reciprocity over time. This selectivity will be misinterpreted by some as exclusion, but it is simply risk management. The broader culture may continue to frame these dynamics as conflict, but at their core, they are adaptive responses to changing incentives. Blame obscures understanding. Understanding enables preparation. As the pressure continues to build, one reality becomes unavoidable. The world no longer rewards passive participation, it rewards positioning. Positioning is not about ideology or slogans, it is about where a person stands in relation to resources, people, skills, and trust. For a long time, many were told that simply participating was enough. Show up, follow the path, comply with the process, and outcomes would follow. That belief worked when systems were expanding. It fails when systems contract. Contraction changes everything. Competition increases, margins shrink, mistakes become more costly. In that environment, positioning determines survival. Women who feel increasingly squeezed are not imagining it. They are encountering a system that no longer has surplus to distribute. When surplus disappears, systems prioritize efficiency. Efficiency favors predictability. Predictability favors those who impose the least friction. Individuals who require accommodation, explanation, or exception find themselves deprioritized. This is not moral judgment, it is mechanical behavior. Understanding this distinction is critical because arguing morality does not change mechanics. One of the greatest disadvantages women now face is that many were encouraged to build lives dependent on external validation rather than internal capability. Validation feels good, but it does not translate into leverage. Capability does. When conditions tighten, only capability carries weight. Credentials without competence lose value quickly. Titles without authority become symbolic. Visibility without contribution becomes noise. Men, often out of necessity rather than preference, were conditioned to develop capability early. They learned through failure, correction, and consequence. This conditioning was uncomfortable, but it produced adaptability. Women were often protected from this process in the name of encouragement. Over time, that protection became a liability. When reality finally imposed consequences, there was no muscle memory for adjustment. Another critical factor is how risk is now distributed. In previous generations, risk was shared across families and communities. Today, risk is individualized. Each person bears the full weight of their decisions. This amplifies anxiety, especially for those without buffers, without a partner, without family support, without community ties. Every decision feels existential. This constant pressure degrades judgment over time. The response to this stress often takes the form of seeking more protection from institutions, more rules, more guarantees, more oversight, but protection scales poorly. Each layer introduces delay, complexity, and dependency. People become trapped in processes designed to manage populations, not individuals. Those who do not fit neatly into categories fall through cracks that no one is responsible for fixing. Men observing this dynamic increasingly avoid entanglement with systems that remove agency. They minimize exposure. They simplify lives. They reduce visibility. This makes them harder to reach, harder to negotiate with, and harder to mobilize. Women attempting to engage with men who have adopted this strategy often misinterpret it as indifference. In reality, it is defensive positioning. This divergence deepens misunderstanding. Women seek reassurance and connection. Men seek clarity and control. Without shared frameworks, both sides feel dissatisfied. Attempts to bridge the gap often fail because they rely on outdated assumptions about incentives. Appeals to emotion do not overcome structural risk. Appeals to duty do not work when authority has been stripped. The cultural insistence that feelings should dictate policy has also contributed to instability. Feelings are transient. Policy is durable. When durable structures are built on transient inputs, they require constant revision. This creates uncertainty. Uncertainty discourages investment. Investment is the foundation of growth. Without growth, scarcity dominates. Scarcity changes behavior. People hoard time, energy, and resources. They become less generous, less forgiving, less willing to experiment. This environment punishes those who rely on goodwill. It rewards those who plan conservatively. Women who were told that the world would adapt to their needs now encounter a world that demands adaptation from them instead. Another overlooked element is how modern culture discourages long term thinking. Everything is optimized for immediacy, instant feedback, instant gratification, instant outrage. Long term projects require patience and delayed reward. Family formation, skill mastery, and community building all fall into this category. When culture devalues patience, these projects decline. Men facing fewer social rewards for participation often disengage from these projects entirely. They focus on personal optimization, health, finance, autonomy. Women, encouraged to seek fulfillment through experience rather than construction, often find themselves with memories rather than infrastructure. Memories do not provide support in times of crisis. This imbalance becomes especially visible during economic downturns. Those with infrastructure weather storms, those without scramble. Governments attempt to fill gaps, but their capacity is limited. Debt constrains options. Promises exceed resources. Disappointment spreads. As disappointment spreads, narratives harden. People search for explanations that preserve self image. Blame becomes attractive because it externalizes failure. But blame does not build resilience, it erodes cooperation. Every accusation reduces the pool of potential allies. Every generalization closes doors. Men, already cautious, respond to blame by further withdrawal. They reduce engagement to transactional interactions where terms are explicit. Emotional investment declines. Trust becomes conditional. This environment is inhospitable to those seeking relational security. Women who recognize this pattern face a difficult choice: continue pursuing validation in spaces that cannot deliver stability, or recalibrate toward environments that reward contribution over expression. The latter path is harder initially. It offers fewer immediate rewards, but over time, it compounds. Recalibration begins with honesty, honest assessment of strengths and weaknesses, honest acknowledgement of trade offs made and opportunities lost, honest recognition of where expectations were unrealistic. This process is uncomfortable because it challenges identity. But identity built on illusion collapses under pressure. Identity built on capability endures. One of the most effective recalibrations women can make is shifting focus from symbolic achievement to functional independence. Functional independence is not isolation. It is the ability to meet needs without excessive reliance on unstable systems, skills that produce tangible value, relationships that operate on reciprocity, assets that retain utility regardless of trends. This shift requires abandoning the idea that fairness guarantees outcomes. Fairness is aspirational, outcomes are conditional. Understanding conditions allows adaptation. Ignoring them invites disappointment. Men who remain open to cooperation will gravitate toward women who demonstrate this understanding, not because of submission, but because of reliability. Reliability reduces risk. Risk reduction enables cooperation. Cooperation creates stability. The broader culture may continue to celebrate narratives that feel empowering, but fail structurally. That does not change reality. Reality rewards what works. Those who align with it quietly build better lives while others argue. As demographic pressures increase, this divide will sharpen. Aging populations will strain support systems. Younger workers will bear heavier burdens. Competition for resources will intensify. In that environment, those without strong personal networks will struggle disproportionately. Women facing aging alone will feel this acutely. Without partners or children, care becomes a transaction rather than a relationship. Paid care is expensive. Institutional care is impersonal. The emotional cost is high. This reality is rarely discussed openly because it contradicts comforting narratives. Men anticipate this future by minimizing obligations that do not reciprocate. They invest in health to reduce dependency. They cultivate skills that maintain relevance. They form alliances based on trust rather than convenience. This is not a battle of the sexes, it is a divergence in adaptation strategies. Those who adapt effectively thrive, those who cling to outdated assumptions struggle. The path forward is not about returning to old roles or embracing new labels. It is about restoring balance between autonomy and cooperation, between freedom and responsibility, between rights and obligations. Women who succeed in this environment will do so by embracing realism, by building capability, by fostering relationships grounded in mutual benefit, by rejecting narratives that promise ease without effort. Men who engage constructively will do so selectively, prioritizing environments where trust is honored and risk is shared. These environments will be quieter, smaller, and less visible than mainstream culture, but they will be more durable. As everything we have discussed comes together, it becomes clear that this moment is not defined by collapse, but by sorting. Periods like this act as filters. They reveal which ideas were durable and which were comforting illusions. They expose which behaviors were adaptive and which were protected only by surplus. When surplus disappears, reality becomes sharper. There is less room for error, less tolerance for inefficiency, and far less patience for narratives that do not produce results. What many women are experiencing now is not sudden misfortune, but delayed consequence. That does not mean anyone deserved hardship. It means that choices were made within a framework that did not present the full picture. Information was filtered, trade offs were minimized, long term outcomes were rarely discussed honestly. People were encouraged to optimize for personal freedom without being taught the cost of independence when it is not paired with cooperation. At the same time, men who once carried disproportionate responsibility without corresponding authority adjusted their behavior. They did not organize. They did not announce their exit. They simply disengaged. They stopped offering effort where it carried excessive risk. They stopped investing where outcomes were uncertain. They stopped participating in systems that treated them as disposable inputs rather than stakeholders. It's just this shift did not happen overnight, but its cumulative effect is now visible everywhere. The result is a society where many women find themselves navigating increasingly complex systems alone. These systems promise safety, but deliver control. They promise support, but deliver conditions. They promise empowerment, but deliver dependency. Without men acting as buffers, negotiators, and providers of informal stability, women are exposed directly to institutional pressure. Institutions are not malicious, but they are indifferent. Indifference is often more damaging than hostility because it offers no avenue for appeal. This is why so many women feel unseen despite constant visibility. They are present everywhere and supported nowhere. Platforms amplify voices but do not solve problems. Policies acknowledge issues but do not absorb risk. Programs offer assistance but not belonging. What is missing is the human layer that once translated effort into security. Men recognized early that this human layer was being dismantled. They responded by creating alternatives, smaller networks, parallel systems, self reliant strategies, reduced exposure. These adaptations were not ideological statements, they were survival strategies. When trust becomes risky, discretion becomes valuable. When cooperation is punished, withdrawal becomes rational. The long term implication of this divergence is profound. A society cannot function indefinitely with half its population withdrawing from informal responsibility and the other half relying on formal systems that cannot compensate. Something has to give. Either cooperation is restored on new terms or fragmentation accelerates. Restoring cooperation does not mean repeating the past, it means learning from it. It means acknowledging that men and women are not interchangeable, but complementary. That stability emerges from shared responsibility, not unilateral independence. That freedom without structure leads to chaos, and structure without trust leads to control. Women who adapt successfully in the coming years will be those who recognize this early and act accordingly. They will invest in tangible skills rather than symbolic credentials. They will prioritize relationships that involve reciprocity rather than validation. They will seek environments that reward consistency, contribution, and accountability rather than visibility and compliance. This does not require abandoning ambition. It requires redefining it. Ambition grounded in resilience rather than applause. Success measured by sustainability rather than status. Fulfillment derived from building something durable rather than consuming experiences that leave no foundation. Men who are engaged will do so selectively. They will look for alignment, not ideology, reliability, not rhetoric, mutual benefit, not obligation. These standards are not exclusionary. They are protective. They exist because the cost of error has increased. The broader culture may continue to resist these realities because they challenge deeply ingrained narratives. But narratives do not shape outcomes, incentives do. Those who align with incentives quietly build better lives while others argue over language. This moment demands clarity, clarity about what works and what does not, clarity about the limits of systems and the necessity of relationships, clarity about the difference between feeling supported and being supported, clarity about the cost of avoiding responsibility. Women were told they could have everything without sacrifice. That was never true for anyone. Men were told they were no longer needed. That was never true either. Both messages distorted behavior in ways that now produce hardship for everyone involved. The future will belong to those who rebuild balance, those who understand that independence is strongest when it is paired with cooperation, that security is strongest when it is shared, that freedom is strongest when it is grounded in responsibility. This is not a message of despair, it is a message of realism. Realism is empowering because it restores agency. Once illusions fall away, choices become clearer, paths become visible, action becomes possible. As you reflect on everything covered in this video, look honestly at your own life. Where are you dependent on systems you do not control? Where have relationships been replaced by platforms? Where has validation been mistaken for stability? These are not questions meant to shame. They are questions meant to orient. The world is changing regardless of whether we acknowledge it. Those who prepare will fare better than those who deny. Cooperation will not return automatically. It will be rebuilt deliberately, slowly, and on terms shaped by reality rather than ideology. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with the direction things are moving? Are you seeing similar patterns in your own life or among people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they help bring clarity to issues that are often ignored or misunderstood. Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.